Tim Hague Reads Books, presented by Tim Hague. When the dust settles, we will observe that more books have been written about New Labour than about almost any other administration yet, including Mrs. Thatcher's febrile season in the sun. But let the Peter Mandelsons and the Alastair Campbells, and even the Tony Blairs make room. Steve Richards of The Independent has written the most incisive, authoritative and readable account yet of the implausible story of Gordon Brown and New Labour. Tim and Steve discussed Brown's astonishing longevity at the top of British politics, his relationship with Tony Blair, and why there is nobody else from that government worth talking about.
Today, Tim Hague Reads Books is talking to Steve Richards, political columnist for The Independent, and the book is Whatever It Takes. Now, Steve, I think it's fair to say, is one of our most distinguished political journalists. You're certainly one of the most quoted. I think everybody reads you. Whenever they quote a columnist on the TV or the radio, it's always you.
Sometimes.
You find that?
No, not enough. You get very frustrated if you're not quoted.
I always hear you.
Thrilled to hear that.
Whatever It Takes is an authoritative but extremely lively and entertaining account of the rise and fall of Gordon Brown and New Labour. Now, you know everybody, all the politicians.
Yeah.
How well do you actually know Blair and Brown?
Very well. I was one of just really through a combination of timing and my kind of political style, I got to know them both well when they were in opposition, and that meant they had more time to spend with people like me. And so I used to see, when Blair was leader of the opposition and Brown was Shadow Chancellor, both of them quite a lot, for cups of tea and things, and a drink sometimes. And similarly, in government, I still saw them quite a lot. Now, that was quite unusual, because certainly by 1997, if not before, there had already become, in journalism as well as in the government, a divide between those who followed Blair and those who followed Brown. There were Brownite ministers and Blairite ministers. There were Brownite columnists and Blairite columnists. I just skated round it and kept in touch with both of them. Brown's people especially cut off any contact with journalists who were close to Blair, and it happened to some extent the other way round. But I saw them both regularly until the very end.
You do make the point that that this government, more than usually, was completely dominated by just two figures. I mean, presumably you knew everybody else as well. But I notice you're not writing a book about, I don't know, Jeff Hoon or Hazel Blears.
No.
These two were the...
with consequences that we're still living through.
In fact, you quote Roy Jenkins as saying to you
he did.
that it must be really hard for political journalists these days, because that's all you've got. You've got two people to write about.
I remember having... Roy Jenkins was a fantastic figure, because he was, in many ways, a titanic politician and writer, but still had an interest in relatively young columnists. And I got to know him quite well. I remember having a glass of wine with him once. He said it must have been very, very difficult for people like you, because in the 70s, political columnists had me, Ben, Foote, Callaghan, Healy, Thatcher, Portillo, Heseltine, and all you've got are Blair and Brown.
Is there a dearth of political talent these days? I mean, has something changed?
Something very profound.
Because you look back at Wilson's cabinet, and it's stuffed with towering figures.
Absolutely.
And you just can't imagine, I don't know, Baroness Varsi sitting in that company.
Exactly. There's been, for reasons which are complicated, and there are lots of reasons, a real decline in big political figures. And the 70s and indeed the 80s was still stuffed full of them. And certainly in the period when I was writing, I'm still writing them, but actually it hasn't changed. There are no giants. I mean, Jenkins is absolutely right. As a political columnist, or indeed an author, you could have switched a column from what Michael Foote was doing to Tony Benn, to David Owen and Roy Jenkins, to Hattersley, and then to Thatcher, to Ian Gilmore and the Wets and all of that. And for a long time, there was just this, in the Labour Party anyway, this duopoly of Blair and Brown, who dominated everything, to the extent that when they departed, Labour was left with a group of half-formed politicians because they stifled and didn't let anyone else breathe. They
or
were,
indeed come up with any policies. I mean, you're very clear about how completely Gordon Brown had his hands on the policy making apparatus, so that nobody else in the party was free to come up with a
except
coherent.
for Blair.
Economic policy. I was
in
thinking.
terms of economic policy, the Treasury was completely dominant in a way that was unprecedented. And I don't think people have quite grasped what happened over that period. There was everything, all the assumptions about that New Labour period are wrong. One of them is that this cliche, Blair was pro-reform and Brown was anti-reform. Now, you can disagree with what Brown was doing in the Treasury, but there was a revolution. The Treasury basically became an alternative government and had its hands in whole swathes of domestic policy, which was a cultural revolution for the Treasury. There was this kind of dual scrutiny and rivalry between Number 10 and the Treasury during this period, quite unprecedented in British politics. And in a weird way, I was talking to someone very close to Brown the other day who was saying to me, at least there was some kind of accountability, that it was completely mad, but whatever came out of Number 10 was scrutinised by the Treasury and vice versa. He was saying there isn't that level of scrutiny now, but I mean, I don't think anyone would advocate what happened in the New Labour era as a model for government.
You don't think that being at loggerheads and unable to work together is desirable.
And that's the other myth, actually. People say, it was just a personality thing. Brown wanted Blair's job. Blair resented the fact that he wanted his job, and they fell out and couldn't talk. It was much deeper than that. They had two very different political philosophies. And again, I think that hasn't come out clearly yet.
You characterise Brown as being slightly disdainful of Blair as a superficial figure, more interested in doing something and being seen to do something, and slightly less interested in what it is that he's doing. Somebody said that he's a bit like John F. Kennedy in that he was a footballer who wanted to score the goals, and he wasn't that interested in which end he scored them, but he wanted to be the one who scored.
I mean, I think you can. I mean, he's a complicated figure to place on the political spectrum. But in terms of policy making, I don't think he was as thought through as Brown. I mean, Brown had terrible flaws, but he used to rush back from meetings with Blair on policy matters and say to Ed Balls and Ed Miliband, his two advisors, Tony never reads the papers. And he didn't mean the newspapers, he meant the detailed policy papers. Now, Brown read papers to a fault. I mean,
Did he work too hard? That's one of the things. You make the point about how hard Brown worked, and with every setback he just went back and worked
harder.
Did he work too hard?
Yeah, he had it in. He was the most fascinating mix in that some ways he was much the most intelligent figure in British politics over that period, I think from 92 to his departure, and he was in some ways the most forensic. He has had no sense how to manage time and how to prioritise, and it was almost a form of illiteracy. Blair, rightly in his memoir, said he was emotionally illiterate, but he had an inability to recognise how to prioritise and compartmentalise and delegate. And that was his fault. But in terms of policy making, he could much more clearly see through the consequences of policy than Blair. I mean, Blair tended to say, well, if we set up a free school, great. If the people like the school, great. Whereas Brown and Balls and Ed Miliband would say, what about the consequences for the rest of for the other schools? And Blair would say, look, let the best hospitals run themselves. And Brown would say, well, if they go bankrupt, we've just raised taxes to pay for these things. How do we deal with it? And I think on every major issue, the euro being another, in policy terms, Brown and Ed Balls were titanic, and Blair was a sort of, average. In terms of communication, Blair was a titan. one of the great communicators of British politics.
He was
ever.
the best of his generation, wasn't he?
By
But
miles.
Blair could tell you something that you knew wasn't true, and you would want it to be true because he'd said it.
Yeah, although the book is quite critical of Blair as a policymaker, and I think, as I say, the whole contortion of the New Labour era was basically, by the end, he was closer to Cameron and the Tory party than he was on the centre-left. Brown was on the centre-left, but was frightened that most of the country wasn't. And these contortions explain everything, basically. But I don't think Blair lied or was dishonest. I think that he was an advocate. And in British politics, advocacy leads people into all kinds of dodgy areas, as you could see with the war in Iraq and other things. But he did have views. I mean, his views on education and NHS reform, and to some extent tax and spend, although he changed on that one, was closer to Cameron's. Cameron was brilliant in recognising that the best thing for him to do to undermine Blair was to support him. And that was a key moment. And Brown recognised the dangers of that moment. And in a way, it became a trap for Brown when he became leader as well, I think.
Brown is often characterised as a failure, and yet you've said yourself that he spent 20 years at the top of British politics. He was uninterrupted Shadow Chancellor and Chancellor of the Exchequer for 15 years, and then achieved the top job. So this is not anybody's definition of a failure. He must have been startlingly good at some things.
Yeah, that's again, it's very interesting. In 100 years' time, when everyone's calmed down about this period because they'll be dead, he will be recognised as a giant and an extraordinary triumph. Virtually no leader in waiting ever becomes a leader. He got there. And to be a Labour Chancellor from 97 to 2007 is, phenomenal achievement.
Has anybody else been Chancellor for that period? I've read Roy Jenkins' book about the Chancellors, and then Edmund Dell did one about post-war ones.
That's right.
And I can't remember a single Chancellor who lasted anything like that long.
No, and especially a Labour Chancellor. They're usually swept aside by some sort of economic disaster. And of course, and the reason I didn't know where to start this book, but in the end, New Labour only made sense this whole period by starting in 1992 after Labour's fourth election defeat. And I argue in the book, and it's by no means without severe criticism of Brown, but I think what he did between 92 and 97 to make Labour electable, but at the same time have a plan. Ed Balls is hugely involved in this. Had a plan to raise money to invest in public services, was titanic, brilliant politics. Now, at the moment, he is so out of favour that he won't get credit for anything. But over time,
well, you
I
say
think
you
that
won't
will
get
change.
credit for anything. Later on, you show in detail how his premiership was rescued by the worst financial and economic catastrophe in more than half a century. I think he still gets credit for that, doesn't he? I think most people can see that he was instrumental.
No, I don't think he does at the moment. I think on the whole, there is a sense that he was to blame for... I mean, I think the Conservatives have won the argument so far on they inherited a catastrophe and Brown left behind a catastrophe. He was, in the short term, saved by the financial crisis because... he was right for it, and the idea that any of the
Do you think
other...
he'll be vindicated? Do you think that history will
I
look
think
back
there's
and
a
say,
high chance
thank
of him
goodness
being,
for Brown?
Yeah, I think over time, in America they're saying it already, that he... I mean,
Well,
this
Krugman said it at
cliche,
the beginning,
that
didn't
saved
he?
the world, is
Saved
widely
the world.
believed in America.
And the cheerleader. He saved the cheerleader too.
Indeed. But for the time being, I think here in Britain, he will be seen as culpable and is, one of the reasons why he's had to disappear from public view is there's no point in him appearing. I think he's viewed with such disdain at the moment, and emotions are running very high, not only outside the Labour Party, but within. A lot of people, the Blair and Mandelson memoirs were utterly condemning and scathing of him. But
although
this book-
Mandelson's was moderately amusing, inadvertently so. Mandelson in his memoir actually has a point where he says, apparently without irony, that Gordon was saying to him, "You're always right, Peter. Thank goodness you're here. You are right again, Peter." And there's no suggestion that Mandelson is smiling when he types this.
Is challenging this assessment of himself. That again is one of, relationships within New Labour, although overplayed by in some books, I think, remain utterly compelling. And I'm not surprised there have been so many dramas about it. And it is a theme of this book, the personal relationship.
Oh, it's a political thriller, the book.
And there's a sort of... and the Mandelson thing is, in a way, illustrative of the Greek tragedy that was being played out. Because if someone has said to Brown when he was at the height of his powers as a chancellor, and people forget he was very popular for a time, as well as successful economically, that he would have brought Peter Mandelson back, who became, irrationally, from the Brownites' perspective, the hate figure. I think he'd have taken, just gone and destroyed himself. The idea would have been beyond contemplation. There he was, as a Prime Minister, desperate, clinging on, pleading with him to come back.
I had not realised, though, that he tried to get Alistair Campbell to go into the Lords, to, as it were, take the role that eventually he called
the
Mandelson back
first discussion was bringing Alistair Campbell back. And
well, that's fascinating.
Ed Balls there was a real drama in the summer of 2008 when they thought David Miliband was going to mount a coup. And they talked together on his holiday in Suffolk, supposed holiday. I don't think he had a break at all, beyond hiring a personal trainer.
Touch of Pilates on the beach.
A bit of Pilates. On Mandelson's advice. When they were discussing their rapprochement, I asked Mandelson about it afterwards. He said, "We had conversations of brutal candour for several months. And I said to him, you need to not only change your public persona, but go deep within. Find out why you get so angry. Do some yoga. Stop drinking coffee." Anyway, apparently he tried to do these things.
But Brown was surprised. Brown, for an incredibly smart person, seemed to have no understanding of himself and the way he was perceived.
No, that's right. There are many sort of mysteries about him. He is an avid reader and lover of reading. His own writing is deadly dull. He is fascinated by the media and communication. His own image was catastrophic. And he, for someone who early on had sharp political antennae, had no self-awareness, and especially in his dealings with other people.
And furthermore, he was obsessed with the media as well, wasn't he? I was interested to discover that Paul Dacre, editor of the Daily Mail, was a close friend, which is counterintuitive.
Utterly bizarre, and baffled his otherwise completely devoted entourage. The two Eds couldn't believe it. But they used to, for a time, he met Dacre weekly, and they talked through things. And he invited him up to Stratford to see a Hamlet and things like this. But I think it was a crude calculation on his part. He thought for a time the Mail would back him. And say vote Labour, which shows.
It's funny, I never thought the Mail would back him.
No, but they to the very end they were pretty nice about it, so it was worth it. But I think the cultivation was a calculated one. Others have other theories that they genuinely had a sort of shared Calvinistic outlook on life. I don't think. I think Brown thought, right, he seems to like me. I'm going to work on this one. But in the end, of course. Like the other papers, he spent a lot of time wooing Murdoch, but they all deserted him. And you could see, I'm now very clear, he was from the beginning as Prime Minister trapped, and the media thing was just one example of many where things were almost doomed to turn against him.
Well, yeah, but you use phrases like a spectacular mistake and colossal error quite a lot with reference to him. Mostly when he's He's prime minister.
Prime Minister, yeah.
It seems ironic that as somebody for whom the job of prime minister for Brown always was to get some things done. He had an agenda. He had a clear sense of what he wanted to achieve. And by the time he gets to that position,
Yes.
he's obsessed with how he appears, and he's obsessed with keeping the job, and
Yeah.
he's lost his grip on his
Yeah,
agenda.
I mean, part of the Greek tragedy is exactly that. He did have, early on, a brilliant, in my view, strategic set of priorities which were ruthlessly implemented over a very long period of time in the most stressful circumstances. But the prime ministership came at least 3 years too late. Ed Miliband said to me he'd run out of juice. Partly he was mentally and physically exhausted by the time he reached the thing that he had dreamed of reaching. So that was one part of the sort of Greek tragedy. Another one was that there was no route available to him by the time he got it in which he could have shown his distinctive private plan for power, which would have been to shift Britain a bit more to the left than Blair. But he was frightened in advance of an election of expressing anything that hinted at that, because he wanted the newspapers to back him, as they had backed Blair, and he had a party management issue in that he wanted to keep the Blairites happy before an election. I think if he had won an election, he might have become a more distinctive voice.
Should he have called the election then? Because
Well,
in
Ed Balls
fact,
is-
you identify the point at which his premiership failed as
Yeah.
that election that never was
Yeah.
in 2007 in the autumn.
Catastrophe.
When he implied that he would go to the country, then he decided not to. But he thought he could play the Tories off. He thought he could
Yeah.
use it as a stick to beat the Tories.
That
And
was
in
a
the end,
terrible miscalculation, example of how his antennae had become completely blunted by then.
So should he have gone?
No, I
Should he
think
have
the
had the
mistake was to talk it up. I'm of the view, Ed Balls is passionately of the opposite view, but I'm of the view that if he had called the election when he called it off, he would have lost. It was the polls were showing a small Tory lead, and the momentum was moving away
Yeah,
from
but the
him.
Tories have always needed a 10% lead to get an absolute majority.
Yeah,
Look
but-
what happened to them in the election when it did come.
But if the Tories had got close to Labour, or in terms of the vote, taken them over, he would have been a diminished. He would have been a diminished figure. And they'll have all said, "Well, Blair won. He's only been in for 3 months. He's lost millions of votes already." You know, and then there would have been the financial crisis. I think it's another example of the trap he was in, from which there was no escape. You know, people were going to talk about an early election. If he had called it, he would have been either diminished or lost. The fact that he didn't call it destroyed his leadership. I mean, there were, and it not only destroyed leadership, it destroyed him. I mean, I saw him a couple of times in the autumn that followed that decision. And for someone who was so calculating and devious and all the rest of it, he was utterly transparent as a political figure. And he was pale, and he had his head down, and he was clearly in a terrible state. And Number 10 was in a terrible state during that period. And he had some rotten luck as well. Everything started to go wrong in ways that were not directly connected with him at all. Those discs were lost with everyone's child benefit details on.
Which,
nothing to do with him.
while a terrible cock-up, was trivial from the point of view of
Completely.
the big picture.
And Alistair Darling was in the Treasury. Is convinced, you know, he's no idea where the disc went, but no one ever found it. So, but there was a growing. He was determined to show that he was pure compared with Blair, with all the police investigations. Suddenly a load of police investigations started while he was in charge, so that blew that one. He was incredibly unlucky. It was as if the gods felt that an order had been disturbed and they were going to go for him. But you see, by the end, I mean, you know, it was not a humiliating end. It seems so now because, as I say, everyone is dismissing him. But that is a phase most prime ministers go through. But the end, when it came, was not a slaughter. You know, there was even a chance that he was going to stay on. Nobody won. And so this incredible, willful appetite for politics and power got him through it to a point where he didn't leave in a humiliating fashion. And similarly, actually, Blair didn't. I mean, they managed incredibly the choreography of politics in a way that, for all the passion being spent behind the scenes, allowed them a degree of dignity in both cases.
But the irony still is that he was much more powerful as Chancellor than he ever was as PM.
And
I mean, more powerful, you think, than can possibly have been comfortable for Tony Blair.
Yeah.
I wonder if Tony Blair should have tried to assert himself. He wanted to have Charlie Whelan fired when they got into government.
Yeah.
And he didn't press that. He could. Could he have? I was going to ask if he could have fired
fired
really Brown in 2005.
Yeah. I went to the launch of Jonathan Powell's book recently, and Jonathan Powell ran Blair's office throughout this period. And Powell and Brown never spoke to Powell, which was a disgrace on Brown's part. But Powell's book is a very one-sided...
He wasn't good at people, though, was he?
No, Powell's book, he gets his revenge in his book, is an utterly one-sided account, which portrays Brown as a mad monster. Now, at the launch, he held a sort of seminar at the launch with Andrew Adonis, and all of Blair's number 10 were in there. And every question was basically, why did Blair put up with him? You know, one after another. And even Brown's wife, Jonathan Powell's wife, asked a question, saying, look, every weekend, Jonathan used to come home and say, that's it, Tony's decided he's going to get rid of him. It's this week. The champagne's out this coming week. He's going to do it. And he never did it. So they all wanted him out. Now, the reason is that Tony Blair, in the end, one of Tony Blair's qualities is he can recognise the qualities of others. Too much sometimes. He was too generous in his assessments of some people. He once said to me he thought Alistair Campbell was a genius about reading the news and things, and he was probably right about that. And he knew that Brown, he in fairness to Blair, he writes it in his book, which was otherwise fairly condemning of Brown, was a big, big figure who brought, in the end, indispensable strengths to the government. And I think even deeper down, I mean, Blair writes in his book, wrongly, that he was in charge of the economy. Completely nonsense. If he had got rid of Brown, there was no one else who had given any thought to centre-left economic policy making available to him. Blair himself had given no thought to it. All of that side was left to Brown and Balls. They were the only two who had really thought through how you could have a vote-winning.
So he didn't have a replacement for it.
Didn't have a replacement. I mean, his line is always, if you put him on the back benches, it would have been utterly explosive, and that's true as well. But I think there was a more fundamental thing, that Brown, for a long time, steered Labour into a position where they could put big money into public services, put up taxes, and still win elections, because it was within a sort of macroeconomic framework devised by Balls that had won the support of the city and business and all the rest of it. It was a massive achievement. And on one level, only on one, because Blair used to fume about him the rest of the time, he knew it and wasn't going to move him.
Do you know if Gordon Brown has seen this book?
I think I've seen him since, and he said, how's it going and stuff. But I don't know. You must never discuss books with
the people who've written about.
I mean, I have had some feedback from lots of other people who appear in it more fleetingly than Blair and Brown, and on the whole, positive on both sides. I mean, you know, I think some of Blair's people are a bit disappointed. I don't sort of rave about him in a positive way. But yeah, I've spoken to a lot of the others. And on the whole, they're very nice about it and say they think it's the account that gets closest to what happened over that sort of extraordinary 15, 16 years.
Well, I'll give you some feedback. I thought it was gripping and highly entertaining. I thought
I'm
it was
thrilled. Thank you.
Just a terrific read.
Oh, well,
so,
thank you very
Steve
much.
Richards, thank you very much. Whatever It Takes, by Steve Richards. It's published by Fourth Estate. It's £14.99.
That was Tim Hague Reads Books, presented by Tim Hague. Tim Hague Reads Books is a Green Shoot production. More details can be found at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.